totally, to me, uncontroversial statement that there's science about why boys and men struggle and suffer. There is science about gender-sensitive and informed ways to work with those men and boys. And I have an ethical obligation to go get on that. And that's what I'm doing here. It doesn't have to be everybody else's frame, but I'm not looking to make converts.
Welcome back to Raising Men. When we talk about raising boys today, it's easy to get lost between extremes about talking about toughness on one side and emotional suppression on the other. But we don't have to choose between cultivating strength and sensitivity. My guest today might show us how emotional resilience is one of the greatest gifts a parent can pass down to their son. Dr. Dan Singley is a psychologist, researcher, and the founder of the Center for Men's Excellence. His work helps men navigate the transition into fatherhood, strengthen their relationships, and build emotional tools for life. He's also the force behind MenExcel, a movement empowering men to show up with courage and authenticity in every area of life, among many other things. Dr. Dan, thank you so much for joining us here today. You're a busy man.
Thanks. Yeah, I appreciate you having me on. I'm like, whoa, now I got to teach everybody how to, have emotional resilience and get their kids straight. We got a lot to cover here today.
In about 20 minutes. It's
right.
It's a tall order, but I think you're ready for it.
No, thanks for having me on.
Now, you've dedicated your career to something that barely existed as a specialty when you went to grad school, which is the psychology of men and fatherhood. Now, that turned out to be a surprisingly brave choice, didn't it? What drew you to this work, and what were some of the challenges you faced?
So there's an old saying, research is me search. And I was in grad school. I was doing like whiteness, like white racial identity development work. And really no one in grad school ever even talked about male gender. We talk about femininity and trans and gender nonconforming and queer identities and so forth. But cis masculinity was just completely off radar. And embarrassingly, it didn't even occur to me. And it was when I got out here to UC San Diego that now a very good friend and mentor of mine talked about early fatherhood and the psychology of men, and that it was an existing area of specialty. I had a 3-week-old at that time and was like, how the hell did I not think about like my fatherhood identity and like really what that means? And then from there, I got joined the San Diego Psych Association at the local level we have a men's issues committee. And then I ended up getting involved with the American Psychological Association and the division that focuses on the psychology of men. And just through the years, I have increasingly focused on the science, the psychological science of men. And my research is on early fatherhood. So paternal, perinatal, and reproductive mental health are just the dude to dad transition. And so I ended up doing a lot of that.
Yeah, you just mentioned that how in your doctoral gender class, you covered everything under the sun except cisgender masculinity. Why do you suppose that is? And what are the consequences of that?
So, I work to stay the hell out of culture wars and politics and all of that. That's
you
not
and me
my
both,
focus.
my friend.
My focus is on how do I take the information, the science, the evidence-based, the research, and turn it into actionable work. And at the same time, like you're asking a fairly straightforward question, and the short version of it comes down to, because in many, if not most areas of U.S. life, men and boys hold unearned power of privilege as a function of their gender, then institutions like the APA, which has rightly focused heavily on, over the past 30 years, elevating girls and women in the field, people of color, people with different sorts of disabilities, marginalized backgrounds, but it's never really been on the APA's radar to focus specifically on men and boys. If you're talking about trans men, yes. If you're talking about Black men, yes. But if you're just talking about like boys and men writ large, that's gotten very, very little attention. over the years. And it's the APA who sets the training standards for if you're going to get a master's or you're going to get a PhD. And a colleague of mine right now in the division on the psych of men is actively working to get that added. However,
Mm.
she's running up against a lot of blocks because
Wow.
the same folks that tend to lose their minds when they feel like the other side is taking an all or nothing zero sum frame themselves usually come from a place of, wait, you're trying to empower boys and men. That means you're pro patriarchy and a men's rights advocate. And by doing that, you're holding women and girls down. And that's just
Yeah.
not true. Like Jim Crow didn't hurt white people.
No.
Legalizing gay marriage didn't hurt straight people. Supporting men and boys does not hurt people of other genders. In fact, the research generally says the rising tide floats all boats. And so I just keep coming back to that.
Yeah, and I mean that feels true. Also, it's more than just the research. It's empirically kind of obvious that the better everyone does, the better everyone does.
Yeah, I'm like, are you a father? No. Do you have one? Okay, so this is relevant to you.
Right,
Like,
right. Or do you have men you care about in your life, or do you
yeah,
have boys that you want to turn into men? All of those things. I mean, this is 95% of the population, and you're just ignoring it.
yeah, and it's one of the things that particularly these days and we can back into this if you'd like, but um, young people, but in particular young boys, have a much rougher go in terms of what it means to be a man and a boy and how to navigate that than I would say a lot of previous generations did. Like the lines are getting blurred and what it means to be tough and a man and a boy and just to your intro, I would say a lot of those aspects of what we call like being sensitive or being emotionally intelligent and then acting on that behaviorally, I would submit that in many ways taking that risk to step out of the traditional guy box is one of the most courageous and manly things, ironically, that some of these people can do.
I would agree. Do you think that there is a problem with masculinity today?
Okay, so let me tease that one out a little bit.
Absolutely. I know how you
Um,
like to avoid culturally sensitive issues. So let me ask you that
yeah.
question.
No, it's actually not that. I'm a psychologist. If I answer a direct question, they'll pull my license. Like I'm not allowed. So
I love it.
no, what I would say is that what it means to be a man continues to evolve.
Mm,
And while some folks see the evolving nature of masculinity as masculinity being under attack, I see masculinity as being under construction
mhm.
in such a way that allows, also to back up. A lot of times when I'm training, I'll do a quick word association and say, okay, just what comes to mind when I say, blank, masculinity, and it's 50% of the time it's toxic.
Yeah.
Right. And there have been some pretty unfortunate messaging in the past that equate masculinity with being bad and with being toxic. But again, I'm just very, very briefly, the research in this area is unequivocal. It is not being male. It is not masculinity per se, which is problematic. It is being rigidly only willing to be that traditional stoic, aggressive, independent, successful, aggressive, like all this, in all contexts. So it's the rigidity about only doing the Marlboro Man routine,
Yeah.
even when the situation calls for empathy, compassion, emotional intelligence, receiving influence from someone else, being able to have productive conflict instead of talk first, talk loudest, stack the data, and all that. And when men and beginning with boys learn to have that kind of flexibility where I can be super aggressive in a contract negotiation over here or as a warrior, right? But on the other side, I go home and I try to tell my wife, like, you better ask how high on the way up. Like, that's not going to work. And
Yeah.
I have had many opportunities with a front row seat with my patients that doesn't work. But when you have that flexibility to enact that what a lot of what we have traditionally called like feminized traits, which they're not, they're just human. But when you can do both, you'll live 5 to 6 years longer. Divorce rates plummet, depression rates and anxiety rates plummet, deaths of despair drug use, like problematic coping, like all these things that we want for the boys and men that we know generally come from being able to operate within the guy box and do that traditional thing when that's what's called for, but to also then have the maturity to recognize that isn't what's called for in this other area and to take the risk. And as I said before, that courageous risk to show up in a different way, because you're running the risk of being shamed and being called a wuss. And when you look at the psyche of men, shame and vulnerability are two of the thorniest, most difficult psychological issues that we deal with.
Yeah, that's so amazing. I think if you marketed a pill on the internet that you could take that would have all of those benefits that you just talked about the depression rates and the feeling of belonging and divorce and all of those things, you'd buy it in a heartbeat. But there is this cognitive dissonance associated with uh, evolving away from or rising above this traditional masculine role.
It
I think
protects you
part of
from shame.
yeah,
That's what it does.
and yeah, and that shame, if I were going to push back on that, what I would say is that, well, aren't you just trying to turn men into wussies? What what do you think about that? What is the answer to that pushback?
I'm not sure how this fits with the demographic of your listeners, but this is what George Carlin used to always call the pussification of the American male.
Yeah,
And I bring that point up because this is not new. Like the historical records going back hundreds and hundreds of years to England in the 17th century had kings worried that the introduction of tea was going to cause lethargy in boys. And, the Boy Scouts were founded early 20th century because of fears that boys were becoming soft and they didn't have so this thing about we're losing traditional masculinity is not in any way new, nor is it necessarily even true. What
yeah,
keeps happening is generation after generation has to evolve and adapt to different circumstances, technological, social, academic, like financial, certainly. Um, and we have to do the downstream figuring out, well, wait, who does this make? And it's particularly different. Like one of the very, very top issues when you look at the reports that look at the state of men these days is this sense of, I don't have the financial power that previous generations did. I followed
yeah,
the American dream. I went to school. I went to work. I worked hard. I'm supposed to be upwardly mobile. But the current generation, they're the first one in recorded history in our country where they're not going to do as well as their parents did, even if you follow all of these things.
yeah.
Now, if you take that hit that a lot of these men are now experiencing post 2008 subprime mortgage crisis, post COVID, and into now, and then you stand hard on the traditional, you're a dude, so protector, provider.
Hmm.
Well, if I feel emasculated with respect to my job,
Yeah,
let's say my partner makes significantly more money than I do, then how do I square that with I have to be a protector, I have to be a provider? And that's just one. Like you get further away from that with like mental health issues. Like if you're going to be a
mhm,
guy, like a hardcore guy, do you get to be depressed? Hell no. Do you get to have anxiety? That's for wussies, right? Actually, we've done research on this, and generally speaking, depression is a feminized, mental health issues in general is a feminized concept,
wow, that is
which of
so
course
true.
we all made up, right? It's just socialized. But when you want to understand some of the major issues that boys and men are facing these days, there's usually a broader like societal context you got to understand,
Yeah.
and then how that's coming into conflict with these learned male roles that are very old.
It goes back to what you were talking about, the flexibility there. It's the
Yes.
inflexibility that is causing that distress. And so what is the right vision of a balanced masculinity as opposed to this kind of rigid view that we have by default?
There is no one size fits all.
Mm,
Like, who am I to come into your home and tell you, hey, the way that you and your partner are enacting your gender roles is wrong. Like,
yeah.
that's totally up to you. Like, so like when every curve has two tails, right? Every normal standardized curve. And so there are going to be people that are, hardcore in one way or the other. Generally speaking, for the men, my message is sit back and ask yourself what parts of doing the traditional, like Marlboro Man guy thing, what parts of those are truly serving you
Mm.
versus what parts of those are holding you back. But in a given household, there's just there's no right or wrong way to do it. But so case example would be look at COVID. Like during COVID,
Yeah.
so my research is on early fatherhood, right? So I focus a lot on dads, but broadly speaking, men did way more of the domestic duties and childcare and caregiving than they had previously because now they were at home,
Yeah.
right? If they didn't work outside the home before, they were there. And the dishes, he's standing right next to him. The kid that needs the diaper change, he's standing right next to it. And so it's not like, oh, I got to go to the office and set up my email. It's like, boom, let's do this. Right. And so there was a spike in that. Now, plenty of other stuff was going on in COVID. People lost their jobs, women lost their jobs, workforce still hasn't recovered in that way, and so on. But as we move on, now we're like, 5 years past, it's regressing back to the mean.
Yeah.
Men are doing less, and that's okay for any given family, but to be thoughtful and intentional about it instead of that's man's work, that's woman's work. You can do that if you choose, and that's the values of your household, but you're also setting up a greater likelihood that actually there's a lot of gray in terms of what's man's work and what's woman's work. Now, people respond to this differently. Like people have different political takes. Certainly, religious theological frames draw to bear about what's the identity of men and fathers and so forth. And if that's your take, cool, like incorporate that. However, if you're having some difficulty with this, consider some ways to work in empathy, compassion, emotional intelligence, doing assertive communication to have more productive conflict. Like this isn't just made up hocus pocus. This stuff is very well researched and pretty straightforward to learn how to do.
So, what does the research actually show about men who can like go outside the house and go to the workplace and be a hardcore badass in business and all of that, but then be empathetic and be vulnerable with their family and their kids and their friends?
Well, one thing that I would say is that dude that has that kind of flexibility is also much more likely to rise higher at work.
Hmm.
Right? Like where I am in San Diego, we're surrounded by tech and biotech and engineers and computer science and executives and so forth. And just because you're a great coder or scientist does not make you a great administrator. A lot of what makes people really solid beyond the, the political, brinksmanship and the resource acquisition and so forth is you can work with people and you can do
Yeah.
that well, not just the like people will take advantage of you if you don't step on their neck. Like, I mean, sure, some contexts will be like that, but I guess the thing I want to say is there are benefits at work to this more balanced, flexible, like those folk. A friend of mine's writing a book, has written a book called Strengths with Heart. And it's
Hmm.
all about heartful strength and leadership in the work context. Some of that research very, very clearly shows followers will follow leaders more when the leaders make the followers feel seen and understood. Doesn't mean the leader's going to do what they say. It means they help them see that. And then in the other areas of life, looking to, directly cultivate, how am I going to do one of the resources that I really, really like, Eve Rodsky has done really cool work with Fair Play. Now that came up out of the Me Too and Time's Up and so on. Um, and the work that she's done, one of the things she developed was this card sort
I'm familiar with
where
it.
people sit down. So I have people do this all the time. And when a couple does it, I'll ask them, be like, okay, bring your cards into next session. And then we'll talk about which of this stuff is manly, which of this stuff is just for girls or whatnot. And just that one conversation tends to start shifting yeah, it turns out, particularly the parenting end of things, this is more like, there's a lot more gray here, I would
Yeah.
say. That's one example that then translates to they live longer, they have less depression, they, don't do as much fentanyl, all that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I've gone through that card exercise with my wife and I've seen other people go through that exercise and it was a very healthy experience for me and my wife. But I've witnessed some other people that really had a tough time with it. Um, both parties became very defensive about, what they brought to the table and all of that. and it just absolutely descended into a melee. And I mean, I've seen it ruin relationships too. Or maybe it didn't ruin the relationship. The relationship was already ruined, and what it did is just shine the light on the fissure there.
So again, when I'm working to do this, before having a couple do that or an individual of mine go back and do it, we do some solid work on the guy himself learning about his own emotional dysregulation, like some
Right.
cognitive behavioral work around,
Yeah.
well, here's the meaning that I'm ascribing to that and how to manage that, and then how to do some productive conflict, like how to lead assertively, not aggressively, because you're right. That can stir. Why do you have so many cards and I don't have enough cards, or you have the right ones, or I just can't back off and all this stuff.
Yeah.
So
You don't
yeah,
have cards for the stuff that I do, but only the stuff that you do.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's tease out. I wanna drill down a little bit into this dude to dad transition and a lot of the focus of your work specifically. Now, you've
Mhm,
called early fatherhood the tip of the spear
mhm.
for contemporary masculinity. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So what I mean by that is that fatherhood, and in particular, more so now than ever, any cohort of new dads in history in our country, they're expected to be involved with pregnancy, with
Yeah.
the birth, in the immediate postpartum. Now, there are all kinds of caveats we can make here about different cultural groups and geographically and so forth. But just generally speaking, writ large, most people, including the fathers themselves, expect to be more involved than statistically their own father would have been. And to be involved not just in, keeping the saber-toothed tigers away and food on the table. Yes, that, but now there's more of an expectation of, well, can they make it to a well baby visit? Can they go, visit, when they're going to image their baby's in utero heart? They can be part of the actual birth planning for the experience. And this is all brand new. And in part, why I say this about the tip of the spear is men are being encouraged to be caring and
Yeah.
caregiving, and in particular with their children, to a lesser extent with their partners, but it all kind of goes together. And so where I'm coming from is this whole thing about balance and flexibility and being hardcore guy over here, and being able to be more flexible and work the room in a more strategic way with empathy and compassion and so forth. That can really begin in early fatherhood, when we as a society give the dad permission to be caring and a caregiver, and to do some of these things that are a bit in violation of, like, traditional guy. Like, who's going to stand up and be like, dude, it's cool to be like an absentee father? Like, that's not the most popular opinion, these days. Now, what that looks like and how you're going to be involved, there's no right or wrong way to do it. But that's one element of it. And what I'm looking for, a lot of the, like, policy and advocacy level work is, now let's look at some ways to take the research around gender sensitive work, like programmatic development, and work to continue that, like to stoke that spark of caring and caregiving that starts in fatherhood, and then keep it going
Yeah.
to romantic relationships, to friendships, to extended family of theirs. Not just a high, like, it's kind of safe for a dad in some ways to be very caregiving in a hierarchical relationship, like with an infant,
Yeah.
right? The
And
infant's not
then you
telling
can
them to
use
go
that
screw
to help
themselves
build
yet.
that muscle in other
That's the plan.
relationships. Yeah.
That's it. That's to me, that's the tip of the spear in the evolution of what it means to be a man, because the evolution of what it means to be a father is more of a yes and than a you have to be this or that.
Yeah, I think that formulation is really, really, really helpful. And if you think about that as an opportunity to cultivate this side that you might not have had an opportunity to cultivate before because of societal pressures or that sort of thing, it really feels like, wow, this is something I really want to, it's something I want to get stronger at. I mean, especially if you think about our culture, uh, it tries to put men in a box and tries to turn them into the marble man. But think about the way that our culture views a man who is both strong and a caregiver. It's I mean, it's laudatory, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. I'm right there with
I
you.
I I mean,
This is
I think there's very little that is as praised in our culture as a man who can be that flexible, and yet it's not something that we're really taught to do, or it's not something that we feel comfortable with.
yeah.
I
Yes.
guess
And
that scarcity is what makes it valuable.
it can be very upsetting and scary to people who, for a variety of reasons, have come to count on that traditional guy way of being when you start saying, yeah, yeah, that's okay. And this other thing, because the other thing can seem very, very threatening
Mhm.
in that way.
Now, some of your research focuses on this paternal involvement with infants and helping men make that dude to dad transition as
Mhm.
healthy as possible. So, what are the key psychological shifts that happen during that? And what separates fathers who really thrive from those who end up struggling with that?
So, um, there are several factors which best predict the father's involvement with his infant. Um, Factor one is his involvement during the pregnancy, right? It's very clear that fathers that are more engaged during pregnancy are also more present and engaged during the birth, and then are also more present and engaged during the postpartum. So there's a strong argument to help get their head in the game early to start
Yeah.
developing what's called paternal role salience, or just the extent to which I have an identity of being a dad. And the dads that have a higher paternal role salience are more likely to be then involved and engaged. Another really key factor is the extent to which the father perceives that that the relationship with his co-parent is supportive.
Hmm.
That across not just my research, like across the whole field. Typically, one of the strongest factors that predicts the father being highly engaged with his infant is he feels a supportive and solid relationship with his co-parent. When it's the opposite and he feels really negatively about it and his perception is this isn't going well, oftentimes that translates to worse mental health, both for him and for his partner, and oftentimes causes his partner to go into a gatekeeping or gate closing mode that controls the extent to which he has access to the kid. And so he can't be as involved or involved in the ways that he wants to. This is by no means universal, but it's a fairly common dynamic that most of us,
So it's
certainly in
either
this
a
field,
virtuous
run into.
cycle or a vicious cycle, and you sort of get to pick which one you're gonna fall into.
Yeah. And so there are other factors like, a trauma history,
Yeah.
depression lessens certain kinds of involvement. Part of what my team did was to work to expand the concept of father's involvement. It used to just be, does he live there? And does he contribute money? And then it was, does he play? Which all those are cool. However, that doesn't encapsulate really what's the modern frame on fathers and involve fathers of infants. And so we developed scale that's multidimensional. It's got 5 different aspects of involvement, basically work and play and emotional involvement, and kind of like a meta perspective and indirect care. And that has changed the conversation from is he involved or not to, well, is he? And what does that look like? And what are the factors that support him being involved? And when he's involved in those ways, how is it helpful not just to his baby and partner, but to him himself? And so, including fathers as a dependent variable in research, meaning how is the father impacted by this? That's fairly new.
Wow. Yeah. That you're when you mentioned about the partners being supportive of each other, it it brings to mind a story from my own journey when my boy was first born. Um, my wife and I mean, we thought we were prepared, but we were not. And we ended the first 2 weeks. She and I were just at each other's throats constantly. We were just it was like and I remember thinking, I can't do this. I cannot live my life this way. And then the next thought that occurred to me was that I'm not going to have to live my life this way. Well, I mean, it's going to be so different in a year
Mhm.
that this isn't, I mean, this is just a short-term thing. Like just let it go. And I remember sitting down with my wife and said, "All right, we need to make a deal. And our deal is we will not get divorced. No matter what happens, we will not get divorced before the baby turns at least 1." And so that actually gave us a time box where it actually freed us up to be supportive of each other because we didn't have to worry that any given pain or any given negative situation was going to last for very long. And it enabled us to do that. And that was our crazy little weird mechanism of cultivating that in each other.
I love that you did that as direct, like that's stopping and really indexing on the fabric of the relationship and
Yeah.
saying things are changing. We don't know what's going to look like in a year. We're not going to make any rash decisions between now and then. Now let's figure this out together. Like, good on you.
Yeah, and there's probably a positive way to frame that. Like, no matter what, I'm here for you, at least until this time. I don't know. It was a weird way to do it. It worked for us, and I don't know. I don't know if I would recommend it to anyone else. Because actually, there is a problem because when the boys started turning a year old, we had an issue where my wife actually she broke down at one point in time. She's like, "Oh, and you're going to divorce me after he turns 1." I was like, "No, man, that wasn't the deal." It's the anyway, it was kind of a funny moment. I'll tell you another story along the lines of something you mentioned before, and that is, and I turned my cheek, and my wife asked me, she said, "Why'd you turn your cheek? Why didn't you just kiss him?" And I said to her, I said, "Men don't kiss each other on the lips." And I realized in that moment, like that is messed up. And I caught myself and I didn't catch myself until about the next day. And I went back to my wife and I said, "Listen, actually that's really unhealthy and I'm going to not do that." And then I started kissing my boy on the lips. And it was a weird thing for me to go through.
I love that because of the concreteness of it. And frankly, when you get down to it, how arbitrary
Yeah.
it is. And I'll go you one for it's funny. It's just like, personal bit of Singley family. My grandfather kissed my dad on the lips. My dad always kissed us. I have 2 older brothers, and like I didn't think anything of it until some
Yeah.
kid in the 2nd grade like shamed me for it at the in carpool. And I was like, it didn't occur to me. I was like, there's nothing like,
Yeah.
sexual happening there. But I'll go you one further. The same kind of direct equating of physicality and body parts exclusively with sexuality
Mm.
has manifested in a series of fathers of little girl babies who are terrified of their daughters' vaginas because to them, their whole lives, that was a sexual organ.
Yeah.
And now they have a little girl and they can't rectify in their minds, well, it turns out it's not just a sexual organ. It's just part of your body, the variety of things. But like, and the dads don't articulate it that way. They're just kind of like, tinky, or I don't know. But unfortunately, they're trapped in the room with a psychologist. And I'm like, all right, we're gonna get into this. And in many ways, it boils down to that, like discomfort. And I would say those are in the same basic arena of we've sexualized it given, sure. I mean, kissing is physical intimacy no matter what. But from there, we say all physical intimacy is sexual, and that is not true.
Wow, that is really, and I'll tell you, I mean, just as I'm examining that myself, I struggle with that too with my daughter. And part of it is discomfort, and part of it is there's a social stigma about that, and I wouldn't
Yep.
want to go anywhere near being accused of things. And but yeah, it feels risky.
At the same time, somebody's got to clean that baby.
I mean, you can't
you
you
know?
can't let the poop be in there.
Exactly right.
That's yeah. Yeah. Actually, it's funny, the other day, um, she had a dirty diaper and literally we're walking into her room to go change her diaper And she says to me, she says, "Dad, would you make sure to clean my vagina?" she's she's 3 years old. Like, yes, baby, I will.
I get discomfort around it. My point isn't it shouldn't have discomfort. My point is let's look at where that's coming from. Let's really look at where that's coming from and
Yeah.
then make a mindful, intentional decision about how I want to show up as a parent instead of, knee-jerk reactivity.
I think that's the perfect way to put it. And just be thoughtful rather than just on autopilot, work on what your unconscious mind is telling you to do. Bring it into your conscious mind and make an intentional decision to do whatever the thing is. And that's fine. Going on autopilot is not fine because autopilot will steer you the wrong way sometimes.
It can.
Yeah.
Sometimes it can be great, right?
Right.
It's just stopping and like there's a way to look at plain old walking, which is not just locomotion. It's putting one foot in front of you to keep from falling,
Hmm.
which is an analogy for mindlessness. I'm not being intentional about this. I'm moving my foot so I don't fall. However, if I were to simply just stand in one spot, look around, scan, and say, now I'm going to lift up my foot and go that way, and my center of gravity is up and down, and I'm not just keeping myself from falling, it's a completely different journey. And that's the way I like to think about the fatherhood journey.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so let's talk a little bit about practical tools. Now, when fathers come to you and trying to figure out how to raise emotionally healthy sons, what are some of the first concrete steps that you tell them?
Well, first of all, it's not really all that different from raising emotionally healthy girls,
Sure.
daughters. But briefly, it begins with a look at authenticity and then a kind of basically a visioning exercise. When you think about 10 years from now, how do you want your relationship with this child to be? And what kind of other relationships are you hoping this child will have? Right. And one really important piece of that that's a critical mirror that I'll shine on some of these dads is to say, for example, if you're partnered or married or whatever, is is your relationship with your partner what you would hope your child will have?
Hmm.
Is the way that you express love, is the way that you express communication, is the way that you handle conflict, certainly if it's in front of those kids or that kid, are you modeling the kind of relationship that you're hoping for that kid? If so, good on you. If not, don't be a wuss. Do the work. And lean into the relationship. There's so much fear and stigma about it, but like at the end of the day, like that, you can do quite a lot with that. The other is for these fathers, just being highly engaged with their infants during just the first year of life predicts both for boys and for girls. Really for the research I've seen is for kids of any gender. They have higher emotional intelligence. They have more words when they get to school. They engage in more controlled risk taking, less involvement with the juvenile justice system. And this is just being around and being hands on. Now, from there, I would say that fathers can play a really, really important role, both for their children by when they when we engage in a parenting fail, which we all do, to go own it to the kid. Hey, when I did blank, that was the wrong thing to do. In the future, going forward, I am going to do blank. And oftentimes being able to name, and when I did that, I felt ashamed, anxious, worried, right? You don't tell this to a 3-year-old. Developmentally, they're not ready for it. But what you can do is say, hey, daddy was upset. Daddy, blah, blah. But what you're doing is setting a family culture and a relationship with the child that very, very, very clearly includes this man is talking about his own emotions and is showing attunement to his young child and trying to understand the child. And you wash, rinse, repeat this over time. And it's very likely to have the effect of simply normalizing being able to talk about feelings and emotions. Like when you get dysregulated, that's one of the reasons why having a highly involved dad predicts children being much better emotional regulators. when they get further down that, and different aspects of kind of the paternal activation relationship and risk taking and so forth. But having a dad that will say emotions, good and bad, are not emotions. And sure, angry,
Mm.
yeah, frustrated, but that's all kind of the same secondary emotion. But a dad that will go to a kid and say, look, I was feeling kind of helpless or feeling ashamed about this. And, I was anxious. And so I know I looked angry, and you're giving them the gift of modeling emotions are not off the table here. You have them, I have them. Let's talk about what they mean. And then they're likely to go through life with the expectation of, if I'm in a relationship and we can't talk at that level, it's probably not going to work for me. And sure, the therapist thinks everybody needs to talk about feelings. Fine. I walked into that one. And just look at the evidence base, right? The guys that can't talk about their emotions, the fathers who only have conflict by like being super confrontational and aggressive, they get divorced more.
Yeah.
They die sooner. Like all these things, and so I'm sorry to keep coming back to this because there's a whole contingent of people, in particular dudes, that don't want to hear be more emotionally available and learn how to interact with certain important, close people in your life at that more affective, emotional, relational level. And you're ultimately going to be happier once you get past the awkwardness, and your kids are going to benefit hugely.
Yeah, I've heard you. We haven't talked about this yet during this conversation, but I've heard you refer to that kind of thing as upgrading your OS. And I
Yeah,
think that is such a perfect way to put it. And maybe in terms of thinking about your job, as you want to make sure that your son or your daughter has a better OS than the one you have. And in doing so, you also want to be able to upgrade your own OS to model that for them. Is that a good way to put it?
100%.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I
If,
love
and,
that image of upgrading your own OS is a very powerful way to think about that, I think.
and it's controversial, right? For folks who want to preserve a more traditional kind of masculinity and fatherhood, which they get to, um, the prospect of an upgrade is very unwelcome. The
Mm,
problem is when you come back to, when you really want to understand the most significant issues facing boys and men these days, it is usually the result of the confluence of broader societal systemic factors and internally learned lessons that don't feel flexible. I have to be this kind of man. Why? And then you ultimately dig down to it and you get to the existential stuff about, unlovability, rejection, isolation, meaningless, and you get away from, well, because evolution says, no, it doesn't. Sorry.
yeah. Yeah, I feel like there's an interesting paradox at work there. And it's probably it might even be a false paradox because a lot of the discourse out there, all the loudest discourse is at either ends of the spectrum. But on one side, you have these like avid men's rights types that are just, absolutely completely resistant to even examining the possible merit of anything you're saying. And on the other side, you have these well-meaning progressives with what is essentially misandry and it's completely unexamined for them. And so how do you navigate? I'm sure that you must see that all the time in your work. And so I'm interested to know how you deal with that. And, how are we muggles supposed to deal with that sort of thing?
But with what specifically?
Well, with this paradox where, on our culture seems to to force people to be on either one side or another, where you almost have to be kind of almost a men's rights types where you don't even want to examine
Mm,
the possibility of the truth of this, or no, you want to be a progressive that is deeply feeling, and you don't even realize that some of what you're espousing is just not even particularly not even particularly well disguised misandry.
right. Well, I can tell you, for me personally, in the work that I do professionally, I'm not in any way trying to convert or appease the more extremist types that are out in the tails.
Yeah.
That's not that being said, I'm in plenty of meetings with folks who do come from a significantly more conservative or significantly more liberal frame, and we've got work to do. And while I'm not going to get on board with aspects that just are not in line with the research or the science and don't don't add up to me, generally speaking, I'm a kill 'em with kindness kind of a person.
Yeah.
Like, folks, I mean, I always look like an idiot to the people on the left because I don't go far enough, and I look like an idiot to the people on the right because I don't go far enough, and that's fine.
But
Um,
my guess is the vast majority of people are probably pretty well aligned to that, and they're not. And even though they're the most vocal people are that way, and the most online
mm,
social media people are that way, the vast majority of people are kind of run the gamut in the middle, don't you think?
it is a profoundly uncontroversial statement that in some ways men and boys struggle and suffer. And so let's figure out ways to help support them. Sure, in the context of power and privilege and all that, yeah. But just as a test case, right? Folks will want to say like all men and and patriarchy and the so forth, and which has its own interesting, like you talked about misandry, like it has its own sort of interesting frame. It's like, well, a lot of times the way that the misandry comes out is not people saying screw men and boys.
Yeah.
It's they're not important. It's benign neglect.
Yeah, because this other thing is important. It's a zero-sum
This
game.
other thing's important, right? But half the population, just under half the population is not really that important. And so for me, just coming back with the totally, to me, uncontroversial statement that there's science about why boys and men struggle and suffer. There is science about gender sensitive and informed ways to work with those men and boys. And I have an ethical obligation to go get on that. And that's
Yeah.
what I'm doing here. It doesn't have to be everybody else's frame, but I'm not looking to make converts. I'm
Yeah.
looking for folks who honestly probably don't think about this stuff very much, but they know a boy in their life who's struggling. They know a man in their life who's struggling. They themselves may be that boy or man who are struggling or suffering, and they're open to expanding a bit. That's who we're going for.
Yeah. I think that's the perfect way to look at it. Now you have two sons, right? They're 21 and 18.
Yes.
Looking back on your journey as a father and now seeing them as young men, what do you think the most important thing that you did right is? And what do you think you would do differently?
I was around. I had to
Mm.
travel. I did a lot of work, and certain jobs had me on the road quite a lot. But no matter what, I was present with them. A lot of camping, we would do trips and so forth. But beyond that, I was there most nights to make dinner and for us to be together just to kind of, BS or, snipe at each other or whatever the thing was. But one of the aspects of it is I was there, I was involved, I was engaged. Far from perfect. Just as many, regrets and guilt as any other parent I know, and I've talked with thousands of them
Yeah.
over the years. But that and I've always tried to follow and I think done a fairly decent job of following the advice that I gave earlier, which is to own my mistakes and own them to my children, to go to the boys and say, hey, when I got angry, I talked with you snarkily. I just said something that if somebody else said to you, I would lose it. And it's not okay for them and it's not okay for me. And I feel embarrassed. I know I looked angry, but the reality was what you did was making me worried. And so going and having that conversation with them, unfortunately, repeatedly, because I would be enacting parent fails over and over again.
Yeah.
Um, that's another element of what I'm proud of in my fathering that seems to have really played out with the two of them.
I owe my son one of those conversations today, actually, because we walked to school and we had a problem and it was my fault. And so I will make you this commitment. I will have that conversation with him today.
I love it.
Uh,
Use
so
use emotion words when you do. I double dog dare you.
I love it. I have two more questions. So
What do you got?
the first is a father is listening right now who wants to break the cycle, wants to be emotionally available to his son. He wants to upgrade his own OS and he's starting from scratch. He doesn't know where to go. What is the one thing he should do right now, this week, today, in order to start on that journey?
Find other dads that you think are cool and begin to develop a community of like-minded dads.
I think as men, I think we underestimate the importance of community. My wife has 9 friends that she shares every detail of her life with, and I have many fewer than that. And
Yeah, I mean, it's
it's a
not just
shame.
you, right?
Yeah.
Like the onset of parenthood, certainly for men, is a well-documented inflection point where we become less healthy. We sleep
Mm,
less. We try to get all of our emotional support and intimacy needs met generally by our partner.
yeah.
We start eating cold dino nuggets because that's what's on the counter when we get home from work instead of like a salad that I'd have to make. And this isolation piece and the letting friendships go. I mean, it's huge. The Surgeon General of the US a couple years back issued an entire report just on loneliness and social isolation, and part of that finding was that being lonely and experiencing unwanted social isolation, which is different than introvert recharge time, overall health effects are, in terms of morbidity, mortality, about the same as smoking a pack of cigarettes a day.
Wow.
Let let that sink in. So my advice to the dad that's listening, question one, dad, are you fairly isolated? Sure, you're around people a lot, but are you actually connecting? Like, do you have two, three other dads that you can talk to and be like, dude, I don't know how you do this work balance thing, or like my relationship's, kind of a nightmare over here, or what do you do with, what's the best 5-point titanium reinforced DOT endorsed, car seat, or whatever the thing is. But
Yeah.
oftentimes dads will take that um, rugged individual, like independence aspect of traditional masculinity and run with it. And the problem is they'll use that to bolster the fact that bro dating is awkward,
Yeah, it
right?
is.
If you're used to like dropping, like you dropped your kid off today, guaranteed you were walking by some other dads with their kids who might seem cool. They had a snarky t-shirt that you were into, or they kind of seem to have like a cool vibe going on or whatever it is. And the prospect of going up and talking and pulling man digits is oftentimes so awkward and so anxiety provoking. But when you ask the dad, it's like, I just don't want to, or I just don't have time for that. It's like,
Yeah.
you don't? You sure you don't? Because I've seen avoidance due to anxiety in pretty much all its forms at this point, and that's a pretty straightforward one.
I invited a guy out to lunch not too long ago, about a couple weeks ago now, and I had a couple different reasons to do it. One of them was a businessy kind of reason, but the other reason was I just like him and I wanted to be friends. And I told him that we were sitting across from each other at lunch. I said, I mean, the reason I wanted, and I know that you and I don't know each other very well, but the reason I wanted to invite you to lunch is, number one, I thought we might have some of these business things, but more importantly, man, I think you're a cool guy and I want to be your friend. And as I was saying this, I felt so uncomfortable. But then when it was done, I felt great.
Yeah, I love that you did. Like it's sort of like when I think about this, I look like developmentally, like I think about like a second grade boy or a third grade boy, and he's
Yeah.
on the playground and he like breathlessly runs up to some other kid and goes, "Hey, I like you. Let's play and be friends." And they run off and like each other and they play and be friends. But by the sixth grade, it's like, no, 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 no.
Yeah.
That's not cool. It's not cool to like things or care. It is what it is, and blow stuff off. But I love that you had like a mandate where you were like, bro, I think you're cool. Let's
Yeah.
play and hang
Well,
out. Like,
and I did. I mean, my son taught it to me. My son does that all the time on let's be best friends. And then they go off together. And I thought to myself, well, that's the way I should be too. I mean, and what a gift if I can keep my son from having to experience that sort of anxiety. So when he gets to sixth grade, I want him to still feel that way about being able to go up to people and be vulnerable and ask him to be friends with them.
then I'm telling you, you modeling that and talking with him about what you're doing and
Yeah.
and the behavioral and what you're thinking and the emotional aspect of it, like keep it up, man. I love that.
I appreciate that. All right. I like to close these discussions by asking everybody the same question. And that's
Mhm.
this: what is one principle that you like to live your life by when it comes to raising powerful, capable men?
Be kind. Have the strength to be kind. I don't think it's more complicated than that. Because what's the opposite of that? Being cruel. And what gets people to cruelty? Usually they feel anxious and helpless and hopeless. But the ones that can be kind, even when it's a challenge, are enacting a kind of strength that I would really like to see more of in the world, particularly these days.
And you never regret being kind, do you? You regret being cruel a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And you're never proud of being cruel.
No, I mean, you might be kind to
Almost never.
someone who throws it in your face or shames you, and that's the risk you're running by being kind. I'm
Yeah.
going to feel weak. I'm going to feel like I got taken advantage of. There are risks to doing this, which is why I see it as courageous and really called for young boys to learn. This is a kind of strength and power.
I think that is a beautiful place to end our discussion. Dr. Daniel Singley is the founder of the Center for Men's Excellence, where he's dedicated his career to advancing men's mental health and father-inclusive psychology. His work with MenExcel continues to empower men to lead with strength, empathy, and emotional intelligence, helping fathers everywhere to raise the next generation of healthy, resilient young men. Dr. Singley, it has been an honor to have you here today. Thank you so much for your valuable
Likewise.
time.
Thanks for having me.
Raising Men is produced by Phil Hernandez. This episode was edited by Ralph Tolentino.